Your wife needs to remove her top and show proof by Friday, Karen Whittendale said, her voice syrupy and brutal all at once, as she slapped a manila envelope against my chest. The board will require full visual confirmation of the body art in question. Otherwise, we'll escalate. She smiled, a clean, HOA-certified predator, as if this were standard policy. As if she hadn't just reduced my wife's medical scars and survival to an aesthetic violation. Karen Whittendale, vice president of the Rivermark Hollow Homeowners Association, had made herself the arbiter of decency in a neighborhood built on ironed lawns and buried secrets. I didn't blink. "You sure you want to put that in writing?" I asked flatly, folding the envelope in half without opening it. "Because once you do, it's public record, and public records are admissible in federal civil court." Her smirk faltered, just slightly. "If you've ever had a loved one survive cancer, or know what it's like to fight for your right to live in peace, hit subscribe right now, because I promise you, this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning." My name is Ellis Draven. I used to work for the Attorney General's office as a forensic document examiner. For 20 years, I built airtight cases against white-collar fraudsters who thought signatures were just ink and timing didn't matter. I retired after my wife beat stage 3 breast cancer. I thought we'd spend our days in silence, not strategy. But here in Rivermark Hollow, silence is what the HOA weaponizes, and now they'd come for Leora. Let me tell you why this isn't about a tattoo. It's about what that tattoo means. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, circles the place where Leora's breasts used to be. After 2 surgeries, 4 drains, a dozen rounds of radiation, and nearly losing her twice in 1 year, she designed that tattoo herself. She said it helped her reclaim the part of her body that cancer tried to erase. We moved here to heal. We picked a corner lot overlooking the lake. Quiet, secluded. Leora had just finished her reconstruction, and the HOA's brochures promised privacy and tranquility. Even marketed the reflection deck as a place for sunrise yoga, mindfulness, and serenity. That's where she was the day Karen's violation notice was filed, stretching quietly at dawn, fully covered, no exposure, no noise. The only part visible beneath her halter wrap was the ink, a circular symbol of everything she'd fought to survive. Somehow, that was enough to trigger an anonymous complaint. And now, this woman, this smug bureaucrat in designer flats, stood on my porch demanding my wife disrobe to verify the nature of her chest tattoo. I watched Karen turn and walk away like she'd won something, as if we'd scurry into shame, as if Leora was just another name she could pencil into her violation ledger and fine until submission. I didn't follow her. I didn't shout. I stood there, envelope in hand, the weight of my wife's story pressing against my chest heavier than anything inside that folder, because I knew what came next. They wanted us embarrassed, silenced. They wanted us to comply with a rule that didn't exist, a morality clause fabricated out of misquoted bylaws and reinforced through HOA gossip masquerading as regulation. But what they didn't know, what Karen didn't know, was that every time I looked at that tattoo, I didn't see indecency. I saw survival. I saw fire, and I've spent my entire career turning paper trails into court victories. This wasn't a mistake. It was a trigger. They chose the wrong household to target. Because the moment she slammed that notice against my chest, she lit the fuse on the story that would eventually burn her career to ash. And the neighborhood? They'd never look at that reflection deck the same way again. Karen's footsteps hadn't even faded from my porch when I turned the folded envelope over in my hands, feeling the pressure of her fingerprints pressed into the paper like a stain. I wasn't going to open it yet. I didn't need to. The contents didn't matter as much as the fact that she had the arrogance to hand-deliver it, to weaponize procedure like a hammer she assumed I'd kneel under. I stepped off the porch and made my way toward the community mail kiosk, needing space to think. Rivermark Hollow's perfect cobblestone paths curved around manicured hedges, each home nearly identical, each window displaying the same HOA-approved shutters. This place was built on the illusion of order, but illusions never hold when someone starts pulling at the seams. The kiosk was a wooden structure painted cream white, the same color the HOA required for every exterior feature. As I approached, a couple stood on the far side, pretending to check their mail, whispering to each other. Their eyes flicked toward me, then quickly away, like guilt moving behind a curtain. That told me enough. The bulletin had already circulated. I walked around to the front of the kiosk and scanned the corkboard. There it was, Karen's latest masterpiece. A printed HOA community conduct alert with heavy bolded lines emphasizing the phrase, inappropriate displays on shared community structures. No names, of course. She was too strategic for that. But she had laid out enough detail that the gossip engine had a full meal to chew on. A neighbor passed behind me and pretended to tie his shoe, though he had no laces. Another couple took the long way around the central fountain to avoid crossing my path. It didn't take much to recognize a pattern. Karen wasn't just enforcing made-up decorum rules. She was preparing a stage, a slow drip of insinuation meant to isolate us before she came in with the fines. It wasn't my first time reading layered intent in bureaucratic language. My old job trained me to see the subtext behind, structured sentences, and this bulletin was designed with surgical cruelty. I traced the lines of text with my thumb and read them the way a prosecutor would. Words like maintain community integrity and prevent offensive conduct weren't benign. They were loaded cannons aimed at residents she considered outliers. But the part that hit hardest wasn't the wording. It was the placement. Karen had pinned it dead center, at eye level, where every resident would see it the moment they reached for their mailbox. A public indictment disguised as policy. A jogger paused nearby. He didn't look at me, but he shifted his pace like he wanted to hear what I might say or do. It reminded me of how crowds behave when something goes wrong in a courtroom. The subtle leaning in, the unspoken anticipation of conflict. Except here, the conflict was being orchestrated by a woman who craved control more than oxygen. I stepped back from the board and finally opened the envelope Karen had shoved into my chest. The first page wasn't a citation. It was a preliminary evaluation notice, a half-legitimate document relying on a patchwork quilt of HOA interpretations rather than actual regulations. And on the second page, she cited a clause that didn't exist in the governing bylaws. She had labeled it as an extension of the aesthetic harmony policy, a line originally intended to regulate lawns, paint, and porch decor, not human bodies. Misinterpretation wasn't illegal, but misrepresentation was. That was when the pattern clicked. The newsletter, the whispering, the misuse of bylaw language. Karen wasn't improvising. She was conditioning the neighborhood to see Leora's tattoo as a disruption before she came after us with full board authority. A preemptive smear campaign. I leaned against the kiosk and exhaled, trying to keep my anger contained. Not because it was unfounded, but because losing control now would feed her narrative. She thrived on reactions. She needed us rattled. She needed the neighborhood to view us as emotional or unstable, so her eventual fines, hearings, and enforcement steps would seem justified. I looked down at the paper and thought of Leora standing at the reflection deck, eyes closed as the early sunlight caught the edges of her tattoo. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't breaking any rule. She was breathing, healing, existing, and Karen wanted to make even that a violation. I folded the notice cleanly, slid it into my back pocket, and began walking home. The neighborhood felt tighter than usual, like the air had thickened with unspoken judgment. But that was fine. Pressure didn't scare me. Pressure revealed cracks, and Rivermark Hollow was full of them. The HOA wanted to make us an example. They wanted us quiet. But I'd read Karen's bulletin with the same precision I used on fraud cases, and I saw one thing clearly. She overplayed her hand. She started the war in public, which meant I could end it there too. The HOA office sat just past the community tennis courts, tucked behind a row of hedges trimmed too precisely to be natural. The sign out front read, Rivermark Hollow Administrative Pavilion, as if the word office was too pedestrian for their purposes. I didn't knock when I entered. I wanted them to see me calm, direct, unshaken. The receptionist barely looked up from her keyboard. Her name tag said Glenda, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You'll need to schedule an appearance if you're here about a violation," she said, voice coated in saccharine indifference. "I'm here to clarify the interpretation memo used in Clause 4.8a, I replied. That caught her attention. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. "Who did you say you were?" "Ellis Draven, Unit 212. This morning, your vice president delivered an accusation to my door without citing a legitimate bylaw. I'm here to correct that misunderstanding before it spreads." Her lips parted slightly, unsure whether to smile or signal security. She didn't do either. Instead, she nodded toward the glass-walled conference room where two men sat across from each other, their posture rigid. One of them was Bramley Koch, the HOA treasurer. Bramley had a meticulous look about him, navy tie, pressed collar, and the kind of nervous energy you only see in someone trying very hard not to take sides. I recognized that posture from dozens of depositions. He was the kind of man who avoided eye contact unless cornered by truth. I gave him that corner. The second man stood when I approached, a younger board member whose name I didn't know. He looked at me like I was a walking audit report. Bramley, however, stood slower, like the weight of the whole situation had finally landed squarely on his shoulders. "Ellis," he said, forcing civility. "Unexpected visit." "Not as unexpected as a body art verification request," I replied. "I'm here to understand how the board justified a clause that doesn't appear in the current bylaws." His jaw tensed. "That's a matter of interpretation. Karen, Vice President Whitendale, believes Section 4.8A on aesthetic continuity applies. It applies to structures, landscaping, paint colors. You're extending it to the human body now?" The other man cleared his throat and stepped away, pretending to read something on a clipboard. Cowardice in khakis. Bramley stayed put, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. That was its own kind of confession. "She's been pushing for a standards memo for a few months," he finally said. "Circulating drafts internally. Not all of us agreed. But she's already enforcing it." "I didn't vote yes," he muttered. "Was there a vote?" I asked. He hesitated. Too long. "No," he finally said. "It was presented as an emergency board decision. Without quorum, that made it a procedural violation." I didn't say it aloud. Not yet. "I'd like a copy of every draft memo circulated since March," I said instead, "and the attendance record from every board session where Clause 4.8A was discussed. That's not standard protocol. It's legal transparency. And I'm not making a formal request, yet." Bramley exhaled, deflated. "I'll see what I can find." There it was. The shift. The unspoken signal. He didn't want to fight me. He didn't want to defend Karen, but he was caught between silence and consequence. And right now, silence was starting to cost him more. I nodded once, turned, and left without thanking them. Outside, the wind had picked up. The tennis courts were empty. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. I walked the long way home, cutting behind the community event center and past the reflection deck, the place where this had all started. It sat empty now, sunlight streaking across its wooden planks, untouched, like a shrine no one dared approach. Leora hadn't been back since the complaint. I paused, gripping the railing, imagining her standing there again, strong in her stillness. The deck had been designed as a sanctuary. Karen had twisted it into a spotlight. Bramley wasn't ready to break ranks yet, but he would. The look in his eyes said enough. He didn't believe in what Karen was doing. He was just afraid. But fear never holds up when the truth starts leaking. Especially not in a neighborhood this polished. The board thought they had the upper hand, but now I had my first crack in the foundation. And I never stop at the first. The next morning, the newsletter hit every doorstep like clockwork. Folded clean, sealed with the HOA's gold-trimmed crest, and slipped just far enough under each doormat to be seen before picked up. Karen loved optics. She wanted people to absorb her message before they even had coffee in their hands. I unfolded ours at the kitchen table, steam rising from my untouched mug. The headline was dressed in calm, professional language, maintaining community standards and shared wellness spaces. But the tone was unmistakable. Paragraph 2 referenced recent reports of visual distractions during sunrise hours, citing a need for neighborly consideration in areas designed for reflection, not spectacle. She didn't name Leora. She didn't need to. Everyone in Rivermark Hollow already knew who she meant. I walked outside with the newsletter still in hand. I needed to see how deep this poison had already spread. The sidewalks were unusually busy for a Tuesday. Dog walkers, joggers, parents with strollers, all polite, all friendly in appearance. But the air was sharp with something else. I recognized the way eyes dipped, the way conversations stopped just before I passed. They had read it, and they believed it. A woman across the street caught my eye as she adjusted her mailbox. She smiled, then quickly turned back to her latch as if the sight of me might mark her as disloyal. Down the path, two teenagers paused their bikes at the base of the reflection deck. They didn't go up, they just stared at it like it was haunted. I kept walking. At the community green space, a few residents were setting up chairs under the gazebo. A book club or a parent circle. I didn't care. What caught my attention was the second newsletter I saw, pinned to the side of the gazebo wall, weighted with a polished brass tack. They were displaying it publicly now. I stepped closer. Someone had underlined a sentence in pen. Residents are encouraged to report disruptive or visually inappropriate behavior using the anonymous portal. Encouraged to report. Anonymous portal. It was less a suggestion than a permission slip for surveillance. The phrase echoed something I'd read years ago in a case file out of Tallahassee. A condo board had turned its residents into informants under the guise of cultural cohesion. That case didn't end well for them, but it started with newsletters just like this. Karen wasn't just issuing reminders, she was deputizing fear. I heard the shuffle of a chair behind me. One of the women under the gazebo, mid-60s, soft features, was watching me carefully. "Something wrong, Mr. Draven?" she asked with sugar-coated concern. "Just reading," I said, folding the paper again. She nodded. "It's just people like the quiet here. Then they should appreciate my wife. She barely speaks to anyone." Her smile tightened. I left before the tension thickened, turning toward the lake path instead. The reflection deck loomed ahead, empty again. For a place built for healing, it had turned cold fast. No one lingered there anymore. Even the wind seemed hesitant to touch it. I stopped at the edge of the deck, but didn't step on. I didn't want to contaminate it with the weight of this game. Leora hadn't spoken much since the first violation. She'd curled inwards, quieter than I'd seen her since recovery. That was Karen's real tactic. Not fines, not rules, erosion. She wanted to wear Leora down until she disappeared. But erosion works both ways. Karen had crossed a line the moment she distributed that bulletin. It wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. It was about narrative control. She was building a version of the truth through repetition, implication, and indirect shame. But what she didn't realize was that every bulletin, every public phrase, every whispered smear was traceable. I walked home slower, thinking through the next step. The timeline, the language, the anonymous reports she kept referencing. Were they even real? Or placeholders for her own complaints under false aliases? Back inside, I laid the newsletter on the counter and photographed it, then every page of the policy manual I had archived. The gaps were visible. The leap she'd made from paint colors and porch swings to visible tattoos would be her undoing. Karen was trying to bury us beneath polished paper and neighborhood etiquette, but paper burns fast when you expose it to the truth. Leora sat on the edge of the exam table, arms folded across the thin cotton wrap she wore. The overhead fluorescence in the medical center made everything too bright, too sterile. But her voice was steady, almost detached, as she answered the nurse's questions about recovery milestones and muscle tension. The appointment wasn't for her chest this time, not directly. It was about follow-up therapy, mobility, scar tissue flexibility. But everything still revolved around what had been taken from her and what she had taken back. I sat beside her, silent, watching her grip tighten every time the nurse scribbled notes. The same hands that used to grip sketch pencils now clenched medical paperwork. This place had become a second battlefield. After the nurse stepped out, Leora finally looked at me. "She made it sound like I did something dirty," she said. "Like I was trying to provoke someone. Just stretching. I know. She doesn't even know what it took to stand there, to wear something without armor, without hiding it." I nodded, but I didn't speak, because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound like comfort, and she wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking for validation, for reality to stop being warped. A soft knock interrupted the stillness, and a woman stepped in, mid-40s, dark blouse, clipboard against her hip. "Mr. and Mrs. Draven?" she asked gently. "I'm Callie. I'm one of the patient advocates on staff. The nurse flagged something in your file and asked if I could check in." Leora straightened slowly. "Did something come up?" "Not medically," Callie said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. But she mentioned a situation at your residence involving body privacy and an HOA complaint. My shoulders stiffened. We didn't use the hospital name. How would they? Callie held up a calming hand. She didn't break confidentiality. She flagged it under emotional distress protocol. When patients report being targeted or shamed for post-surgical anatomy, we're allowed to offer guidance under the Federal Survivorship Dignity Act. That stopped me cold. I thought that act was still under pilot programs. It passed last year, quietly. It protects patients from public or organizational harassment tied to visible markers of medical treatment, like surgical scars, devices, or symbolic tattoos placed over surgical sites. It was designed for veterans and breast cancer survivors, and it's enforceable. Leora blinked. So, what Karen did could be classified as a rights violation, depending on how the language was used, and whether there was a demand for public exposure or proof, Callie said, especially if any documentation used her medical history as basis for compliance. I didn't answer. I was already turning the puzzle over in my mind. Karen's demand, the phrasing in the bulletin, the anonymous complaint system. She wasn't just overreaching. She was possibly violating federal protections she didn't even know existed. Can I get that statute in writing? I asked. Callie smiled softly and handed me a pamphlet. This has the summary, plus the reporting contact if you choose to pursue it. We've had cases before where HOAs tried to cite patients for exposure when it was clearly tied to reconstructive surgery. Courts don't like that. I thanked her, tucked the brochure into my jacket, and held the door open for Leora. Her steps were heavier than usual, not from defeat, from restraint. In the parking lot, she stopped short of the car and looked out at the horizon. The sun had just begun to tilt, casting golden slants between the buildings. She's going to spin it, you know, she said quietly. Say it was about the tattoo, not the body. She already is, I said, but that won't hold up anymore. Because now we had a name for what was happening, not just injustice, but a violation of dignity backed by enforceable protections. Back at home, I laid the pamphlet next to Karen's newsletter and snapped a photo of both side by side. Then I opened a new folder on my computer and titled it Exposure, Legal Prep. Karen wanted a show of proof. She was about to get it. 2 days later, the second notice came. This time, it was taped to our door, center, eye level. The tape thick and deliberate, like it had to be felt to be believed. Karen wasn't subtle anymore. She wanted escalation. I peeled it off slowly, careful not to rip the paper, and read the header, Final Warning, Non-Compliance with Community Decorum Review. Beneath it, in sharp black serif, the wording was clearer than before. If visual confirmation of the body art in question is not submitted by 5 p.m. Friday, your household will be placed under formal review, subject to rotating daily fines and community hearing. No mention of Leora's name, no mention of mine, just language designed to separate the act from the person. Strip the humanity away, and what's left is easier to punish. I brought the notice inside and laid it next to the first one on the kitchen counter. Both documents stared up at me like teeth. Leora stood across the room, arms crossed, eyes pinned to the window. She hadn't said much since the medical center, but she didn't have to. The silence between us had weight now. A shared understanding that this wasn't just about a woman with power issues. It was about what happens when someone decides your survival story doesn't fit their vision. She didn't ask what the letter said. She already knew. She's trying to break you, I said. She won't. The words came sharp, brittle, but her hands betrayed her. One gripped the edge of the windowsill, knuckles pale, fingers trembling in place. It wasn't fear. Not quite. It was something more dangerous. The kind of rage you learn to swallow because you're tired of always being the one who has to explain why your body isn't shameful. She wants photos, Leora said. What kind? Angles? Resolution? Should I add lighting? Stop. My voice cut too fast, too loud. But she didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her expression calm, in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. Because calm meant she was detaching. And if she detached now, Karen would win. Not on paper, not in policy, but where it mattered most. She thinks I'm weak, she whispered. That I won't stand in front of them and let them look. That I'll crumble before they see what I chose to put there. I took a breath, grounding myself. I don't want you to give her anything, I said. Not a photo, not a moment, not an inch. I'll handle it. Leora didn't answer. She just nodded once and left the room, leaving behind the echo of everything she didn't say. I turned back to the table and gathered the documents again. This time, I scanned them into the legal folder I'd started. Karen had made 2 fatal errors already, issuing an enforcement letter based on a non-existent clause and demanding visual proof of medically tied body modifications. Both could be used to construct a pattern of harassment under the Survivorship Dignity Act. But I needed more than letters and laws. I needed proof that she was acting outside the bounds of her position, that she wasn't speaking on behalf of the board, just using it as a mask. That's when I remembered Bramley's hesitation in the HOA office, the way he stumbled when I asked if there had been a vote, the way he'd said, "Karen's been pushing for it, not we, not the board, Karen." I opened the HOA's member portal and pulled up the last 6 months of meeting notes. The official PDFs were sparse, sanitized, missing too much. But one entry caught my attention. April 11th, a board session marked agenda closed to public. The file contained only 3 lines, the last of which read, "Deferred approval of language memo pending quorum." Deferred, not passed. I checked the date of the first letter Karen delivered to our door. 3 days later, that was the thread. She had enacted authority she didn't have, enforced a clause that wasn't approved, and backed it with community-wide messaging. That wasn't just abuse of power, that was fabrication. I printed everything and laid it across the table like a timeline. Newsletter, meeting minutes, final notice, medical documentation summary, advocacy statute. I didn't need to break the system. I just had to show the neighborhood that she was already doing it. I found Bramley Coke outside the neighborhood cafe, hunched over a small table with a stack of manila folders and a coffee cup, going cold. His glasses slid down his nose as he tapped at a spreadsheet on his tablet, lost in whatever numbers occupied his. Attention more than people ever did. He didn't see me coming until my shadow crossed his table. He looked up, startled. "Ellis, I didn't expect—" "You said you didn't vote yes," I said, cutting to the bone. Bramley's eyes darted toward the cafe windows. Whether he was looking for Karen or just witnesses, I didn't care. I dropped a printed copy of the April 11th meeting notes onto the table. Deferred approval, no quorum. Yet 3 days later, my wife gets a violation citing language from a memo that never passed. Bramley swallowed hard. He looked like a man balancing on a fence, knowing wind was coming from both sides. "I shouldn't even have let that memo circulate," he said. "It wasn't official. Karen typed it herself, said it was just a proposal. Then why is it being enforced like policy?" He didn't answer. I sat down across from him. "Look, I'm not here to embarrass you. I know what it's like being the only reasonable one in a room full of people too afraid to speak up. But Karen's turning this place into a courtroom without rules, and she's using your silence to back her authority." He ran a hand over his face and leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. "She convinced the others that the clause already fit under existing aesthetic regulations, said she had legal context to support it. Did you see that context? No, she just handed us a memo and said it was covered under Section 488A, which governs landscaping and porch swings," I said flatly. Bramley looked down at his folders. "I didn't sign off on it, but I didn't stop her either. Then help me stop her now." He closed his eyes for a beat. When they opened again, they were tired, but clearer. "I have the original memo," he said, "with the metadata, time-stamped drafts, version history, email logs, and the attendance sheet from April. Only 4 members were present. Karen claimed there were 6. I didn't argue then. I should have." He reached into his bag and pulled out a USB drive, setting it on the table between us like it might burn a hole through the wood. "I kept everything," he said. "Not because I planned to use it, but because I knew one day I'd have to." I took the drive and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "You just changed everything." "Make sure it matters," he muttered, "because once this breaks open, I'm not the one they'll protect. They won't have the chance." I stood and left without shaking his hand, not out of disrespect, but because we both knew what had passed between us didn't need a gesture. Back home, I plugged in the drive and copied the files into my case folder. Drafts of Karen's memo showed it had been revised 3 times, all by her, none with board member feedback. The last version had the phrase, "non-conforming visual elements applied to body surfaces." Her attempt at dressing up a body-shaming clause, in legalese. The email trail showed she sent the memo to 3 residents before the board ever saw it, all known loyalists who regularly filed anonymous complaints. She'd used them to build a fake consensus, then cited those reports to justify the policy she invented. It wasn't just abuse, it was premeditated narrative control. I cross-referenced the violation letters we'd received and matched them to the timestamps of the memo circulation. Every step, every phrase, every so-called policy trail led back to her inbox. By midnight, I had a complete digital map: drafts, emails, meeting minutes, board quorum sheets, violations, newsletter bulletin, and at the center, Karen Whittendale, the woman who'd decided that a tattoo symbolizing survival was a threat to her carefully curated version of community purity. Leora stepped into the room, her robe pulled tight around her shoulders. "Did he give you anything?" "Everything," I said. She nodded, her face unreadable. "I'm not showing them anything," she said quietly. "You won't have to," I replied. "I will." And this time, I wasn't just documenting misconduct. I was preparing to put it on stage. I spent the next day constructing the case the way I used to in the AG's office: meticulous, irrefutable, layered with intent. But this time, it wasn't for a courtroom. It was for the court of public opinion, where perception wasn't just evidence. It was ammunition. Karen had used whispers, paper trails, and moral performance to craft her reality. If I wanted to dismantle it, I had to do more than disprove her. I had to show people what she really was. Not just wrong, but dangerous and hypocritical. I started by organizing the digital timeline, each file numbered and labeled. Draft 1 of the memo, sent only to her inner circle. Draft 2, shared with select board members. Draft 3, time-stamped a full week before the April meeting, with language that was never reviewed, voted on, or filed in the official record. I inserted screenshots of her emails beside each memo, along with open-source metadata from the file properties. She hadn't even scrubbed them. Each edit had her initials. Each send had her personal IP. Then I created a side-by-side comparison of Rivermark Hollow's actual bylaw, 4.8a, and the fabricated clause she invented. The original, paint colors, structural harmony, mailbox finishes. Her version, body surface modifications, visual distractions, standards of propriety. She didn't just stretch the rule, she rewrote it. The violation letters we'd received used her language verbatim. That alone tied her fabricated policy to active enforcement. It was policy laundering, taking invented language, pushing it through a chain of implication, then claiming it came from authority. Next, I added a photo of the newsletter bulletin pinned to the gazebo. Beneath it, I overlaid a caption: "Anonymous complaints encouraged, but only against those who look." Different. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a wall collapsing. I kept the emotional core anchored where it belonged: Leora's story. The final page of the file showed the Survivorship Dignity Act summary pamphlet from the medical center, with the clause that explicitly protects post-surgical tattoos as medical expression. Below that, I added a typed excerpt from Leora's journal entry with her permission. The first time I looked in the mirror and didn't flinch, I saw the Ouroboros. The scar wasn't gone, but now it had purpose. Now I could breathe without apology. That was the soul of it. Karen tried to make shame out of survival. I saved the file as Exhibit R, Rivermark Realignment. Next, I called Mira Aston. She was a former civil liberties litigator turned journalist, running a blog that specialized in HOA corruption cases. I'd followed her work during my last years in office. She had a talent for exposing injustice without turning it into spectacle. She didn't just want scandal. She wanted truth with consequences. She picked up on the second ring. "This is Ellis Draven," I said. "You wrote about that Fort Sinclair HOA case last year." "Yeah, the one where they banned wheelchairs from patios. You AG folks finally took that one to court, right?" "I retired before the trial, but I've got something worse." I explained the memo, the newsletter, the threats, the federal protection violation. Then I told her about the tattoo. There was silence on her end for a long moment. "Do you have the documents?" "All of them, plus timestamps, drafts, and a quote from a hospital advocate. And my wife's permission to publish her story." She didn't hesitate. "I'll run it, I'll name names, and if what you're saying checks out, I'll circulate it before the HOA's next meeting." We agreed on delivery by morning. She would fact-check it herself. I trusted her to. This wasn't about dramatics. It was about exposure with precision. After I hung up, I backed up the file 3 times, one in the cloud, one on a drive, one printed and sealed. I wasn't going to give Karen a single inch to cry slander. When I returned to the kitchen, Leora was there, standing at the window again, but this time her hands were steady. "You're really going to do it?" she asked. "I'm not doing it to win," I said. "I'm doing it so no one else has to go through this in silence." She looked at me, eyes clear, and nodded. I had everything I needed now, the words, the evidence, and the reason no one could argue with. I arrived at the community media center just after 9. The front doors were unlocked, but the inside was quiet. Lights low, except for the editing bays along the far wall. The center was mostly used for local newsletter production and archiving committee meetings, but Mira had arranged access through a volunteer coordinator she trusted. I had 2 hours to prep the video and lock, everything in place before it went live. I didn't rush. I uploaded the archive folder, connected my backup drive, and started building the timeline in the editing software. Each piece slotted into place: Karen's memo, drafts with timestamps, board meeting minutes, the final violation notice, the side-by-side bylaw comparison, and the quote from the Survivorship Dignity Act. I added smooth transitions, black text on white backgrounds, no dramatic music, no cheap theatrics. This wasn't a hit piece. It was evidence, unvarnished. The final segment was the most important. Leora had recorded it the night before, sitting in soft lamplight at the edge of our bed. No makeup, no edits. Just her voice, steady and slow, reading an entry from her journal written 1 year after her surgery. I didn't want to get the tattoo at first. I thought it would make people stare, but the scar already did that. I got it because I needed to see something I chose, not something cancer took. Then she looked up at the camera and added a single sentence. I shouldn't have to explain that to anyone, especially not in my own neighborhood. That clip was only 28 seconds long, but it made the entire case breathe. Once the video was finished rendering, I sent it to Mira through the secure drive she'd provided. She'd already scheduled a post on her site's homepage, with a featured headline ready to go. When HOAs cross the line, the story of a survivor, a tattoo, and a manufactured violation. It would go live 30 minutes before the next HOA meeting. Karen would walk in thinking she was still in control. By the time she sat down, the rest of the neighborhood would already know. On my way out, I passed the old photo wall in the lobby. Pictures of past block parties, tree planting drives, ribbon cuttings for dog parks and donation drives. Karen was in at least half of them, smiling like someone who believed her version of community was the only one worth living in. That wall would look different by tomorrow. I left the media center and walked straight to the reflection deck. The lake was still, catching the early gold of an afternoon sun that hadn't quite committed to being warm. The deck itself looked untouched, but I noticed something new pinned to the support post. A small paper sign, handwritten, no signature. Let her breathe, let her stay. I didn't know who left it, but someone had. I walked out onto the deck and stood where Leora had stood. My feet landed in the faint impressions her shoes had once left behind. I tried to picture her in that moment, not as a victim, not as someone under attack, but just as a person seeking peace. This had never been about rebellion or conflict. It had been about quiet, and Karen had tried to turn it into a spectacle. I pulled out my phone, opened the HOA portal, and requested to speak during the community comment portion of the meeting. The request went through instantly. Behind me, footsteps approached. I turned to see Leora walking down the path, wrapped in a light shawl, no makeup, her hair pulled back. "You don't have to come," I said. "I know, but you are." "I'm not there for them," she said. "I'm there so I can say I stood on my feet when it counted." We stood side by side on the deck for a long moment, watching the water. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out the sealed printed folder, and held it against my chest. Karen had asked for proof. I was going to give it to her, just not in the way she wanted. By the time we arrived at the community meeting hall, the air had shifted. It wasn't loud, no murmurs, no pointed stares, just a strange quiet, like a room bracing for a storm that hadn't yet made landfall. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and the usual faux wood podium stood beneath the HOA banner with its pristine gold lettering, Rivermark Hollow, preserving harmony. I spotted Karen near the front, flanked by 2 board members. She wore a navy dress, a pearl brooch pinned high on her collarbone like a badge. Her posture was immaculate, but her eyes were scanning, searching. She knew something was off. The usual hush wasn't deference, it was distance. Bramley sat 2 chairs to her left, hands folded in his lap, spine stiff as rebar. He didn't look at us as we entered. He didn't need to. His silence had already spoken. Leora and I took our seats near the back. I placed the sealed folder on the empty chair beside me and powered up my phone. Mira's blog post had gone live 23 minutes ago. Comments were pouring in. Then I saw it. Someone had posted a screenshot of our newsletter, circled the clause in red, and added, "I thought this place was for families. How did we let this happen?" The tide had started to shift. Karen took the podium exactly on time. Her voice was calm, controlled. She opened with a report on tree pruning along the south perimeter, then pivoted to a new motion about repainting the clubhouse shutters, standard procedural theater. Then she paused, looked down at her notes, and said, "Before we continue, I'd like to address a recent misinterpretation that has circulated through unofficial channels." A few heads turned. Phones shifted in laps. "There appears to be confusion about a memo I drafted for board review regarding visual appropriateness in shared community spaces. I want to clarify that no final vote has been cast and enforcement has not been formally activated. Any communication implying otherwise was simply part of a preliminary discussion process." I felt Leora stiffen beside me. Karen had read the headline. She was walking it back. But it was too late. My hand went up. Karen froze for half a breath. "Yes, Mr. Draven. I'd like to speak during community comment, as approved in the portal this morning." A long pause. She nodded tightly. "You have 3 minutes." I stood, folder in hand, and walked to the podium with the calm of someone who'd already laid every brick of the road ahead. "My name is Ellis Draven, Unit 212. I didn't raise my voice, didn't rush. I worked for 20 years in the Attorney General's office as a forensic document examiner. I've spent most of my life tracing timelines, decoding manipulation, and proving procedural violations." Karen's jaw locked. "In the last 10 days, my wife received 2 written notices requesting she submit photographic evidence of a medical tattoo tied to post-surgical reconstruction. These requests cited an HOA clause that doesn't exist. One of those documents was taped to our front door." I paused. A shuffle moved through the room. In response, I compiled a timeline of all related documentation: internal memo drafts, email distributions, meeting minutes, digital timestamps, and enforcement notices. I held up the folder, all of which show that Karen Whittendale unilaterally invented, distributed, and enforced a policy never ratified by this board and targeted a cancer survivor's healing process as a violation of community standards. Someone in the second row gasped. A woman stood up in the back. Karen opened her mouth, but I kept going. "This is no longer about bylaws. It's about dignity. It's about power misused under the pretense of procedure. And if this board does not immediately suspend Vice President Whittendale pending a full ethics review, I will submit this entire record to Mira Aston at hojustice.org, who has already published the first half today." The room erupted. Whispers. Phones raised. Karen stepped back from the podium, face blank, lips tight. I turned, walked back to my seat, and handed Leora the folder. She held it like a badge. For the first time in days, she smiled. Not wide, not loud, but real. Karen didn't speak for a full 30 seconds. That was long in a room where tension was thicker than the air. She just stood there, her hand still resting on the edge of the podium, like she could hold on to authority with her fingertips. Then she cleared her throat and tried to steady herself. "We're not here to litigate feelings," she began, voice a shade softer than usual. "This board has always acted with the best interest of Rivermark Hollow in mind." She emphasized best interest like it meant something more than control, but the room wasn't with her anymore. A man 2 rows from the front stood up, his hand still holding his phone. "My wife's a survivor," he said. "She's got a tattoo across her abdomen. You gonna find her next time she goes to the pool?" Karen didn't answer. Another voice, an older woman this time, someone I'd never seen speak in these meetings before, raised her hand halfway, then dropped it. "You put this place on the news," she said. I got friends texting me this morning asking if I lived in the HOA that punished cancer survivors. My grandchildren read that headline. Karen finally looked toward Bramley, as if waiting for backup. But Bramley stayed seated, still and composed. She was alone. And she knew it. "I'd like to propose an emergency motion," Bramley said suddenly, his voice cutting through the air like a clean knife. "Effective immediately. A temporary suspension of Vice President Whittendale's duties, pending ethics investigation and procedural review." Silence. Then, "Seconded," from the woman in the back. Karen's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." But Bramley didn't look at her. He looked at the rest of the board, and the board members, all of whom had let her lead, all of whom had nodded along while she drafted power from silence, began to shift in their seats. A slow, collective exhale, the kind people give when a weight lifts they didn't realize they were carrying. Votes were cast without ceremony. The final tally was unanimous. Karen's gavel, she always brought it even when she wasn't chairing, remained untouched on the table. She stood there for a moment longer, blinking as if waiting for someone to step in. No one did. She gathered her clipboard, pressed her lips together, and walked out of the room with quiet, bitter grace. No eye contact, no parting words. Just a door opening and closing behind her. Bramley stood and addressed the room. "The board will issue a formal apology to the Dravens and conduct an internal review of all non-ratified memos circulated in the last year. We'll also be contacting the HOA insurance carrier to disclose the risk this incident may have posed. If anyone has concerns or questions, you'll be heard." There were no cheers, no clapping, just stillness. Just the sound of something unspoken shifting in a place built on curated silence. I reached for Leora's hand. She squeezed back, tight, warm, present. After the meeting ended, people approached her, not all of them, not the ones who'd posted anonymous complaints, but a few. A woman with silver hair and pink running shoes. A teenage girl who lived 2 houses over. A middle-aged man who never made eye contact before today. They didn't gush. They didn't apologize for the neighborhood. They just said, "Thank you." Outside, the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. The light turned gold over the rooftops and scattered across the lake like shards. We didn't rush to leave. Leora lingered near the reflection deck, watching the way the shadows fell across the planks. There was still a faint paper edge caught under one of the support posts, the same sign someone had left before. Let her breathe, let her stay. She smiled at it. "I never thought this place could feel quiet in a good way," she said softly. "It's ours now," I told her. "Not hers." And it was true. The board was hers. The rules were hers. The fear was hers. But the silence? That finally belonged to us. The following week, the reflection deck didn't look like the same place. Someone had swept the planks clean, polished the railing, and replaced the old decorum reminder plaque with a small bronze plate that read, "Community Sanctuary. Respect the space." No mention of rules, no citations, just words that meant peace again. Leora and I walked there together, early evening, when the light hit the lake in ripples of orange and copper. She carried a small canvas tote under her arm and didn't tell me what was inside. We didn't need to talk much anymore. The noise had finally left. The HOA had issued its formal apology 2 days earlier, an official email from the board's account, signed by Bramley, acknowledging procedural misconduct and misuse of authority. It included a paragraph citing the Survivorship Dignity Act and a promise to add a new clause protecting medical privacy. It wasn't dramatic, but it was permanent. A scar turned into structure. Karen's name wasn't on it. She hadn't returned to Rivermark Hollow since that night. Word spread that she resigned quietly and moved 2 counties over, where her sister managed another association. Someone joked that she'd probably start rewriting rules there too. But I didn't laugh. People like her didn't stop. They just relocated their spotlight. Still, this neighborhood had learned something. Fear didn't keep order. It built cages. At the next board meeting, Bramley stood at the same podium Karen had once ruled from, hands steady as he announced the new transparency initiative. Meetings would be recorded, memos publicly archived, complaints logged with traceable IDs. It wasn't revolutionary. It was honest. And honesty had been missing from Rivermark Hollow longer than anyone wanted to admit. When it was over, he walked up to me in the parking lot. "You know," he said, "I should have done more before it got that far." I nodded. "You did enough when it counted." He smiled faintly. "You gave me a reason to." That night, Mira's article had gone national. Not viral in the way scandals go, but steady. The kind of story that sticks because it's real. She'd called it the tattoo they tried to erase. The final paragraph quoted Leora directly. The same words from her journal entry. "I needed to see something I chose, not something cancer took." When I read that, I didn't feel victory. I felt quiet relief. The kind that settles deep in your chest after a storm has spent itself. Now, standing on the deck again, Leora pulled the canvas tote open and took out a small paintbrush and a container of marine-grade sealant. Without asking, she knelt near the edge of the deck and began painting soft, swirling strokes in the pattern of her tattoo. The Ouroboros. Only faint outlines, nothing bright, just enough that under the right light, the form appeared, a circle within a circle, looping endlessly. I crouched beside her, watching the reflection of the symbol shimmer on the water. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defiance. It was reclamation. "This is how I want to remember it," she said. "Not what she did, what we kept." She didn't mean the fight. She meant the peace that survived it. We stayed there until the sun dipped below the tree line and the light broke into fragments across the lake. When she finally stood, the Ouroboros glowed faintly in the fading gold, and for a second, I could see both of us in it, the destroyed and the reborn, one feeding the other. Neighbors began to arrive one by one, quiet, uncertain, curious. A few brought candles, some flowers. No one spoke. They just stood, letting the silence rest between us. Not the old kind of silence, the fearful kind, but a new one, the kind that comes when truth stops hiding. I thought about all the years I'd spent dissecting documents, tracing signatures, proving deceit. This time, it wasn't paperwork that changed anything. It was people seeing what they had ignored. Karen's rules were gone. Her fear didn't live here anymore. I took Leora's hand as the wind brushed the surface of the lake and carried the smell of cedar from the shore. Her fingers laced with mine, warm and deliberate. "This place doesn't own us," she said quietly. "No," I said. "But maybe we finally own it. If you've ever fought to reclaim peace after someone tried to shame your story, you understand what it costs and what it gives back. Share this with someone who needs to know that truth, once spoken, can't be erased. Tell me in the comments what kind of justice you still believe in, and maybe, just maybe, we'll write the next one together.